The gavel is halfway up. And a mother is about to lose everything she has left. 30 seconds. That's all the law gives her. 30 seconds to become a stranger's wife, or watch her children get split up and shipped off like sacks of grain. This is the story of a woman everyone called too much trouble to want. And the one man in town who looked at her and saw something nobody else did. Snow was falling sideways across the square in Widow's Bend, Wyoming. The wind cut through coats like they were made of paper. And in the middle of all that cold stood Clara Whitfield, holding on to her family with both arms, because it was the only thing left she had any control over. 7 kids. 7 pairs of small hands grabbing at her coat, her sleeves, her skirt. The oldest was 13. The youngest wasn't even old enough to understand why grown men were staring at his mother like she was livestock nobody wanted to bid on. 47 men had already walked past the platform that morning. 47 men had looked at Clara and said no. Some of them didn't even bother whispering it. They said it right out loud, like she couldn't hear, like her feelings didn't count for anything anymore now that her husband was dead and her pockets were empty. Too heavy. Too many mouths to feed. Not worth the trouble. Clara didn't cry. She'd stopped crying a long time ago, back east, when she realized tears never once put food on a table. She stood up straight even though her legs were shaking underneath her second-hand skirt. Even though her hands, jammed into gloves with holes worn through the fingers, had gone completely numb. Her daughter Josephine, 13 years old but carrying the weight of someone twice her age, stood pressed against her side like she could somehow shield her mother from the cold and the stairs at the same time. Her son Walter, 11, was doing his best impression of a man, jaw locked tight, trying not to let anyone see him shake. The twins, Miles and August, stood quiet as stones, watching the crowd the way rabbits watch a hawk circle overhead. Little Charlotte and her sister Ruth held hands so tight their knuckles had gone white. And down at the bottom, hiding behind Clara's skirt with just his eyes peeking out, was 3-year-old Henry, too young to understand any of it, but old enough to know something was very wrong. Here's something most people never think about until they're standing in the middle of it. The world doesn't ask if you're ready for the worst day of your life. It just hands it to you and starts the clock. Lot number 17, the auctioneer called out, sounding about as interested as a man counting fence posts. Clara Whitfield. Widow. Age 31. 7 children between the ages of 3 and 13. A few men in the crowd actually laughed. Not one of them was thinking about her courage, or the fact that she'd kept 7 children alive through a brutal winter on nothing but grit and stubbornness. They were thinking about cost. About how many mouths that was. About how much work a woman that size could actually do. Opening bid, the auctioneer said. $50. Includes travel costs, settlement fees, and the children. Silence. The kind of silence that makes you question whether the world has any decency left in it at all. Clara had known this moment was coming since the day she signed those papers back in the city. She'd known it the day she sold her furniture piece by piece just to buy train tickets west. She'd known it the night she watched her kids eat what she quietly understood would be the last warm meal they'd have for a while, because debt collectors don't care if children are hungry, and factory owners don't care if you work yourself down to bone and still can't make rent. The West was supposed to be a fresh start. Turns out desperate hope is still hope, even when it comes wrapped in a nightmare like this one. $70, the auctioneer tried again. Somebody in the front, a heavy-set man wearing a beaver hat, spat into the mud at his feet. Too big, he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. And 7 brats on top of it. Might as well be buying a plague. Josephine's small cold hand slipped into her mother's. Clara squeezed back, because right then, her children needed her to be steady more than they needed her to be anything else. $50, the auctioneer said again, his voice sharper now, edged with impatience. Last call. Behind the platform, two officials stood waiting with a folder of papers. Clara recognized the woman holding it. Thin-mouthed, tight-faced, from the settlement office. Miss Pruitt. Those papers were the backup plan. Orphanage placement. Labor contracts. A legal way to cut Clara's family into 7 separate pieces if nobody bid. The auctioneer raised the gavel higher. If no bid is received, he announced, the children will be placed under territorial custody, per the Orphan Placement Act. Henry made a small sound. Mama. Just that. One word, barely above a whisper. Clara knelt down despite her aching knees screaming in protest against the cold ground. She touched his cheek, wind-burned and red. Hush now, love. Just a little longer. Then she stood back up and forced herself to look at the crowd one more time. Most of the men wouldn't meet her eyes. A few stared back like they were pricing cattle. Not one of them saw the woman who had stitched wounds with a sewing needle and thread by candlelight, who could balance a household ledger better than most bank clerks, who could stretch a single loaf of bread across 7 hungry children and somehow make it work. All they saw was her size. Her burden. Her cost. Going once, the auctioneer said. Clara's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. Going twice. Josephine's tears finally broke loose, silent, sliding down her cheeks. Walter's fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. The younger ones huddled together like maybe if they got small enough, the world would just forget they existed. And then a voice cracked through the crowd. Deep. Rough. Like gravel sliding down a mountainside. I'll take her. Every single head in that square turned at once. The man who stepped forward didn't look like he belonged anywhere near a town. He looked like the mountains themselves had sent him down just for this moment. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Wrapped in buckskin and fur that had clearly seen more winters than most men in that crowd had seen birthdays. His boots left deep prints in the half-frozen mud with every step. Dark hair, streaked with gray, hung loose past his shoulders. His face was carved from hard angles, sharp cheekbones, a jaw like stone. And his eyes were pale, almost colorless, like ice on a lake in the dead of January. The crowd parted for him without anyone saying a word. Like water moving out of the way for a boulder rolling downhill. The auctioneer blinked, genuinely stunned. You said you'll take her. You understand she's got 7 children. The man didn't so much as flinch. All 7. A murmur rolled through the crowd, and it wasn't kindness. It was shock. Men leaned toward each other, whispering. And then one name rippled through the square like a warning passed hand to hand. Gideon Marsh. Clara's stomach tightened at the sound of it. She'd heard that name whispered in town before she ever set foot on that platform. The mountain man. The one who almost never came down from the high country. The one people said carried more than just scars from the war he'd fought in. The one folks said was dangerous simply because nobody really knew him. Gideon stepped closer to the platform. His eyes moved across her children, not unkind exactly, but sharp, assessing, like a man taking stock of everything in front of him before he made a decision he couldn't take back. Then his gaze landed on Clara directly. She made herself hold his stare. If this was the last gamble of her entire life, she wasn't going to spend it looking at the ground. How much? He asked the auctioneer. $50 is the current offer, the auctioneer stammered. Gideon's jaw tightened. 300. The crowd made a sound like a collective gasp swallowed halfway down. Even Miss Pruitt's head snapped up, her composure cracking for just a second. The auctioneer stumbled over his words. That more than covers everything. Passage, settlement fees, provisions, all of it. Gideon nodded once. Good. Then let's not waste any more daylight. The gavel came down. Not like the sound of doom Clara had been bracing for her whole life, but more like a door closing quietly behind her, and somewhere out ahead, another one creaking open. Clara felt dizzy, and not entirely from relief. Because underneath the relief was a colder, sharper feeling. A man doesn't hand over $300, more money than most folks around here saw in a year, for nothing. A man doesn't take on 7 children he's never met unless he's got a reason. And Clara had learned the hard way that reasons aren't always good ones. Gideon turned to her, his voice low and even. Mrs. Whitfield. You understand what this is? Her throat had gone bone dry. A marriage contract. That's right, he said. Shelter and food for work. A roof over your children's heads. Something in his eyes, still hard, still unreadable, seemed to steady just slightly. I've got a homestead in the high country. 2 days' ride. The trail's rough and the winters up there don't play fair. Work is hard, every single day of it. I need somebody who can run a household, manage what supplies we've got, and keep things standing when I'm out working the land. Your kids will eat well and stay warm, but they'll work too. Everybody earns their keep on my land. I'm not selling you a dream, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm offering you a way to survive. He let that sit in the cold air between them for a moment. You want it or not? Clara looked at her children. 7 faces. 7 entire futures hanging on whatever word came out of her mouth next. She glanced once, just once, toward Miss Pruitt and that folder full of papers waiting to tear her family apart into pieces. Then she looked back at Gideon Marsh, the man this whole town had quietly agreed to be afraid of. I want it, she said, clear enough for everyone nearby to hear. I accept. Gideon nodded, sharp and final, like a man closing a deal he'd already made peace with. Then we go now. We're burning daylight. The paperwork took only a few minutes. Clara's hand trembled as she signed her name, and somewhere in that moment it hit her, strange and sudden, that she might never write Clara Whitfield again for the rest of her life. After today she'd carry a stranger's name. Her children would grow up under a stranger's roof, miles from anyone who could help them if things went wrong. While Gideon counted out gold coins, Miss Pruitt pulled Clara aside, her voice low and urgent. Do you know anything at all about that man? No, Clara admitted honestly. Miss Pruitt's eyes flicked toward Gideon. There are stories. That he killed men. That he came out west running from something. From justice, maybe. Clara's jaw tightened. There are stories about me too. That I'm lazy because I'm heavy. That I'm not worth $50. I've learned stories can be a lot crueler than the truth ever is. Miss Pruitt looked troubled, but she nodded slowly. Just be careful. I will, Clara said. Within the hour, they were leaving Widow's Bend behind. Gideon had a sturdy wagon already loaded with supplies. He lifted the smaller children in like they weighed nothing at all, then offered Clara his hand. His palm was rough with calluses, but warm despite the cold. She took it, because there wasn't any other path left for her to walk. The town disappeared behind them. Clara didn't look back once. Ahead, the land opened up wide and wild, sagebrush and tough frozen grass stretching toward dark stands of pine, with mountains rising against the sky like teeth. Her children huddled together under blankets in the back of the wagon, whispering in tight, nervous little voices. Josephine sat up straight the whole ride, watching Gideon like she was trying to solve a puzzle nobody had given her the pieces to. For a long stretch, Gideon said nothing at all. Just the creak of wagon wheels and the steady rhythm of hooves against packed snow. Clara's mind kept circling back through every warning she'd ever heard whispered about men like him. Then, without turning to look at her, Gideon finally spoke. "You warm enough?" "Yes," Clara said. "The children too?" He nodded once. "There's blankets in the back if you need more." It wasn't warmth exactly, but it was something close to care. And something inside Clara, some tight coiled thing she'd been carrying since her husband died, loosened just a fraction. As the afternoon wore toward evening, the trail started climbing. The air turned sharper, thinner. The mountains loomed closer with every mile. Clara found herself watching Gideon's hands on the reins, steady, sure, scarred across the knuckles. Finally she found the nerve to ask the question that had been sitting in her chest since the auction block. "Mr. Marsh, why did you do it?" Gideon kept his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "Because I needed help. And because I don't leave children to be torn apart by men with paperwork." Her chest tightened. "You knew what they'd say about you. You knew they'd laugh." "I don't care what they say," he answered simply. "I care about what I can build." The word settled heavy between them, and neither one of them said anything else for a long while. By dusk they were deep into the foothills, and the wind had started carrying that particular smell that only comes before snow. Clara pulled her children in close and stared up into the darkening sky, wondering exactly what kind of man buys a family nobody wanted, and why an entire town seemed to hold its breath at the mention of his name. Because somewhere ahead, past the tree line, past the cold, waited his homestead. And Clara had a growing feeling that what waited there wasn't just hard work and long winters. It was the real truth about Gideon Marsh. The storm hit before sunrise on their second day of travel. It came down off the mountains fast and thick, like the sky itself had decided to bury the whole world in white. Snow swirled so hard Clara could barely see past the horses' ears. The wagon lurched as the wheels caught in deepening drifts, and the children clung to each other beneath the blankets, too scared to even cry out loud. Gideon drove like the storm was nothing more than a stubborn crosswind. His jaw was set, his eyes narrowed under his hat, reading the land the way Clara used to read a factory ledger, calm, precise, certain. But even he couldn't ignore how fast things were turning dangerous. "We need shelter," he called out over the howling wind. "There's an old trapper's cabin not far from here. If we don't reach it, this storm will freeze us before nightfall." Clara tightened her grip on Henry, her fingers numb but her fear keeping her hands locked around him anyway. "How far?" "Half a mile," Gideon said. "Maybe less. Hard to say with the snow this thick." Half a mile felt like 50 in weather like that. The wagon groaned under them, the horses snorting and tossing their heads against the wind screaming down the mountainside like it wanted to tear them straight off it. Clara pulled the blankets tighter around Ruth and Charlotte, whispering steady words she didn't fully believe herself. "It's all right. We're going to be all right. Mama's here." Gideon leaned forward, guiding the horses through a narrow bend, and the wagon slid sideways across a hidden patch of ice. The children gasped in unison. Clara grabbed the bench to keep from being thrown. Gideon snapped the reins gently, steadying the horses with a calm, low voice. "Easy now. Good boys." He never once raised his voice at those animals. That surprised Clara more than she expected. A man who looked so hard, being that gentle, sparked something warm inside her chest despite the freezing air around them. Minutes crawled by like hours. Snow piled heavy on the wagon cover, threatening to cave it in. Clara knocked it off whenever she could reach high enough, her arms burning, her breath ragged and painful in the cold. The children shivered under their blankets, breathing out little clouds of white. Then Gideon pointed through the storm. "There." At first Clara saw nothing but endless white. Then, slowly, a shape emerged. A low log cabin, half buried in drifted snow, leaning slightly but still standing firm against the wind. Relief hit her so hard it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Gideon urged the horses forward. "Hold on. Ground's rough here." The wagon bounced across frozen roots and buried rocks before finally stopping beside the cabin. Gideon jumped down immediately, moving fast and sure, lifting the youngest children first and carrying them straight inside. Clara followed, slipping on the icy ground, hands shaking as she herded the older kids through the door behind her. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, but dry. A stone hearth sat waiting against the far wall, thick dust coating the table and floor, proof nobody had used this place in a long while. "Stay with the little ones," Gideon told her. "I'll get wood." And before she could answer, he'd already vanished back into the storm. Walter, brave but clearly shaken, hovered near the door. "Mama, is he coming back?" "Yes," Clara said, hoping to God she was right. "He won't leave us." Josephine had already moved to the fireplace. "Mama, I can help start a fire." "Good girl," Clara whispered. By the time Gideon returned with an armful of wood, the hearth was cleared and ready. He dropped the logs, packed kindling underneath, and struck his flint. The flames caught slow at first, then bright, pushing back the cold with thin but life-saving heat. Gideon stomped snow from his boots, his face half lit by firelight, looking like something carved straight out of the mountain and the storm together. "We'll stay here tonight," he said. "Maybe tomorrow too, if the storm doesn't break." Clara nodded. "Do the horses have shelter?" "There's a lean-to out back." "It'll hold them," he said, his voice softening just slightly. "They're tough. Used to the cold." The children huddled close around the fire. Henry crawled into Clara's lap, his small body trembling, and she wrapped her arms tight around him, letting the flames slowly ease his shaking. Gideon brought blankets in from the wagon and laid them around the hearth. "You and the children sleep close to the fire. I'll keep watch." Clara frowned. "You need rest too." "I don't need much," he said. "Been living out here a long time." His eyes met hers. "Storms like this bring trouble. Animals sometimes. Men sometimes. Somebody has to stay awake." Clara wanted to argue, but she could see that stubborn set in his jaw. He'd already made up his mind. As the fire built up its warmth, the children slowly relaxed. Josephine read softly from an old copy of Robinson Crusoe she'd found in Gideon's saddlebag, her voice steady and soft. The younger ones drifted off one by one, leaning against each other. Walter and one of the twins tried hard to stay awake, but exhaustion won out eventually. Clara sat watching all of them, counting their breaths, touching their hair, making sure with her own hands that they were still there, still warm, still hers. Something in her chest loosened in a way it hadn't in months. Gideon sat by the door, rifle across his knees, firelight throwing sharp shadows across the hard lines of his face. "You saved us today," Clara said quietly once the children were finally asleep. He shook his head. "Just did what needed doing." "Still," she said. "Thank you." Gideon didn't answer right away. Gratitude seemed to sit uncomfortably on him, like a coat that didn't quite fit. Finally he nodded once. "You did your part too. Kept the little ones calm. Held those blankets tight. People break in storms like this. You didn't." Heat rose in Clara's cheeks, and it wasn't from the fire. "I couldn't break," she said. "Not with 7 children counting on me." Gideon studied her then, unhurried, his eyes hard to read, not cold, not warm, just steady. "You're stronger than you think," he said. Nobody had ever told her that before. Not once. Back home, neighbors had called her soft. Factory bosses called her slow. Even her own family had whispered she'd married above her station. But Gideon Marsh, mountain man, stranger, the man the whole town whispered about like he was dangerous, saw something completely different in her. It unsettled her and steadied her at the exact same time. Here's a thing worth sitting with for a second. Sometimes the people who scare a town the most are the ones who never learned how to perform kindness for an audience. They just quietly do the right thing when nobody's watching, and let the rumors fill in the blanks however they want. That was Gideon. A reputation built entirely out of silence, misread as danger. The storm hadn't let up by morning. If anything, it had gotten worse. Snow piled against the cabin door, nearly sealing it shut. Wind howled like something alive out there. Gideon had kept the fire going the whole night, Clara knew, because she'd woken several times and seen him moving quiet and steady, feeding the flames, checking the windows, listening. As dawn broke faint behind the clouds, he handed her a tin cup of hot coffee. She blinked at it, surprised. "You didn't have to. You'll need the strength today," he said simply. "Storm's still bad. Cabin should hold, but we've got to dig out or we'll be trapped here longer than we can afford." Clara wrapped her cold fingers around the warm cup, the heat sinking into her bones. "Thank you." The children stirred slowly. Josephine sat up first, rubbing her eyes. "Is it morning?" "Sort of," Clara said. "Storm still going strong." Josephine moved to check on her siblings with the same protective instinct her mother had, and Clara felt a small ache watching her, because 13 was too young to be carrying that much responsibility on such small shoulders. Gideon checked his rifle and stood. "I'm going out to clear the roof. Too much snow piles up, it'll cave the whole thing in." Walter sat up straight immediately. "I can help." Gideon looked him over. "Your hand steady." Walter nodded fast. "Your legs strong." Another nod. Gideon gave a short, approving grunt. "All right. But you do exactly what I say. No wandering. No trying to prove anything." "Yes, sir," Walter said, swallowing hard. Clara hesitated. "Is it safe?" "No," Gideon said honestly. "But it's necessary." Outside, the storm slashed at them both like claws. Snow clung instantly to Gideon's hair and beard. He moved with total confidence, shoveling a path from the door up toward the roofline. Walter followed, working hard but clumsy in the deep drifts. Clara watched through the small window, her stomach twisting, until she saw Gideon tap her son's shoulder and show him how to angle the shovel properly, lifting instead of pushing. Patient. Calm. Teaching, not scolding. She hadn't expected that from him either. Inside, she fed the younger children, warmed more coffee, and tried not to imagine the worst. After nearly an hour, the door burst open and the wind shoved Gideon and Walter back inside, both covered head to toe in snow. Walter's cheeks were bright red, but his eyes were shining with pride. "You did well," Gideon told him as he hung his coat by the fire. "You listen good," Walter said back, trying to hide a smile and failing completely. Clara felt something shift in her chest again. Maybe it was trust. Or at least the very beginning of it. The storm finally broke that afternoon, and the world went quiet and white. Gideon fed the horses and checked over the wagon. Clara dried wet clothes by the fire. The children gathered close, playing small quiet games just to stay warm. By evening, that cabin felt less like a desperate hiding place and more like a strange, temporary kind of home, just for now, just until the storm passed completely. That night, once the children were asleep, Clara sat by the fire with her sewing kit, mending a tear in Ruth's skirt. Gideon sat near the door again, slowly sharpening a knife, his movements unhurried and sure. "Why did you come down to Widow's Bend this week?" Clara asked. "People say you barely come to town at all." Gideon paused, running the blade against the stone. "Needed supplies." "That all?" He hesitated. Then, quietly, "Wanted company." Clara looked up. Gideon didn't meet her eyes. "Been 10 years since I lived with anybody," he admitted. "Place gets quiet. Too quiet." She waited, sensing there was more coming. "They said in town there'd be a bride auction," he continued. "I didn't plan on buying anybody. Just wanted to see. Wanted to see whether any woman out there could actually live my kind of life." "And could they?" Clara asked softly. Gideon looked at her directly now, his eyes clear and steady. "Only one could." They sat there in silence after that, the fire crackling between them. Clara's heart was beating faster than she wanted to admit, but she didn't look away. She didn't want to. By dawn the next morning, the storm had fully cleared. A pale sun rose over the mountain range, turning all that fresh snow to silver. Gideon hitched up the horses and they prepared to move again. The children helped as best they could. Walter held the reins steady while Gideon checked the harness. Josephine folded blankets with careful, serious hands. The younger kids stayed close to Clara, cheeks pink from the cold. "Will your homestead look like this?" Charlotte asked, pointing out at the glittering snow. "No," Clara said with a small smile. "I think it'll be even prettier." Gideon came around the wagon carrying a crate. "Ready?" Clara nodded and lifted Henry up into the wagon, then climbed in after him, tucking the blankets around the older kids beside her. Gideon took the driver's seat, clicked his tongue, and the horses pulled forward. They'd traveled maybe an hour when Gideon suddenly lifted one hand, sharp and quick. "Quiet." Clara froze. Her children did too. Gideon's eyes had narrowed at the trail behind them. "Someone's following." Her blood ran cold. "Who?" "3 riders," Gideon said. "Coming fast." Fear punched straight through Clara's chest, and her hands grabbed for her children without even thinking about it. "Are they dangerous?" Gideon didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened. Most men riding fast through the mountains aren't coming for a friendly visit. He urged the horses into a brisk trot, his whole posture suddenly alert. Clara could hear her own heartbeat pounding, the wagon wheels crunching against the snow, her children's small frightened breaths all around her. Then she saw them. 3 dark shapes cutting through the tree line, closing the distance fast. "Stay calm," Gideon said, his jaw locked tight. "Whatever happens, keep the children behind you." Clara nodded even though her whole body felt like it was about to shatter. Then a voice rang out from the trail behind them. "Marsh!" "Hold up!" Gideon muttered something low under his breath. "Vain." Clara's heart dropped like a stone straight through her chest. The name felt like a curse just hanging in the freezing air. "Who is he?" she whispered. "A man who doesn't take no for an answer," Gideon said. "And a man who wants what I have." "What you have?" Clara asked. But her question got swallowed by the thunder of hooves as the 3 riders swung around and cut directly in front of the wagon, forcing it to a hard stop. The scarred man leading them smirked, eyes sliding from Gideon over to Clara. "Well now," he drawled. "Looks like you picked up some cargo." The meaning behind that word made Clara sick to her stomach. She pulled her children in closer. Gideon reached slowly for his rifle, and Silas Vane's smile only widened. The mountains around them seemed to hold their breath. Danger hung there in the cold air like smoke that wouldn't clear. And somewhere deep inside Clara Whitfield, dismissed, overlooked, called too much trouble by nearly every man in that auction crowd, something woke up. Something fierce. Something that would not let anyone tear her family apart again. Not ever. Vane rode closer, his horse snorting steam into the freezing air, hooves crunching snow as he brought it almost nose to nose with Gideon's lead horse. His grin widened the moment he spotted Clara and the children bundled in the wagon, his eyes dragging over them the way a man appraises livestock at market. "Well, well," Vane said. "Heard you bought yourself a ready-made family, Marsh. 7 kids. Quite the haul." Clara felt her children press tighter against her sides. She wrapped her arms around Henry and Ruth, praying they couldn't see just how frightened she really was underneath. Gideon kept the rifle resting steady across his lap. "State your business, Vane." "My business is simple," Vane said, tipping his hat back to reveal a long scar cutting across his cheek. "You've got something I want." "I don't have anything of yours," Gideon said, voice dropping low. "Oh, but you do." Vane winked at Clara. "Word around town is you snapped up a bride who wasn't even meant for you. Society was fixing to place her and those brats somewhere else. Man with real money might have wanted first pick." Clara's stomach twisted. Vane wasn't here for some old grudge. He was here to claim ownership. He wanted them. Gideon's jaw tightened. "You're too late." Vane leaned forward in his saddle. "I think I'm right on time." He pointed a gloved hand toward Clara. "A woman like her would last a lot longer with me. I know how to work a wife properly. And the kids, well, I could find plenty of use for them too." Clara gasped softly. Josephine grabbed her mother's hand. Walter looked ready to leap right out of the wagon, fists clenched tight at his sides. Gideon's voice turned to pure steel. "Back away." Vane laughed. "Always figured you were too soft, Marsh. Living up in those mountains, pretending you're not like the rest of us. But you can't hide from the world forever." 2 of Vane's men shifted their horses, flanking the wagon on either side. Gideon adjusted in his seat, keeping the rifle level and steady. "You've got one chance to ride away," he said. Vane smirked. "Or what? You gonna shoot me in front of a lady? In front of all her children?" He clicked his tongue. "That don't seem very husband-like." And right then, Clara understood something Gideon had never said out loud. Vane wasn't just some bully passing through. He was genuinely dangerous. And Gideon Marsh, a man half this territory whispered about like he was something to fear, was afraid of exactly what Silas Vane might do next. Clara swallowed hard, her voice trembling but steady enough to carry. "We don't belong to you." Vane's smile sharpened. "Sweetheart, everything out here belongs to whoever's strong enough to take it." Gideon lifted his rifle another inch. "Last warning." Vane's eyes narrowed, all the amusement draining right out of his face. "Fine," he said, and reached for his pistol. Everything happened at once. Gideon fired first. Vane's hat spun off his head as the bullet clipped the strap right near his ear, sending him lurching back in his saddle. His men jerked their reins in shock, horses rearing up, snow spraying everywhere. Vane roared out a curse, and before he could even finish it, Gideon had already jumped down from the wagon, boots sinking deep into the snow. "Stay inside," he barked at Clara, then charged straight at Vane, grabbing the man's coat before he could fully draw his weapon. The 2 men crashed down into the snow together, grappling, throwing punches, rolling down a small embankment. "Mama," Josephine cried out. Clara pulled her back hard. Walter tried climbing over the side of the wagon. Clara yanked him back too. "No. But he's alone out there," Walter shouted. "He's not alone," Clara said, her voice shaking but certain. "He's ours." On the slope below, Gideon fought with a quiet, focused fury. Vane swung wild, cursing, his face twisted with rage. Gideon blocked one blow, landed another, then another, snow mixing with drops of blood, their breath rising like steam in the freezing air. Vane clawed desperately at the knife on his belt. Gideon seized his wrist and twisted hard until the blade dropped uselessly into the snow. But Vane was vicious, and worse, he was desperate. He lunged for Gideon's throat instead. Clara didn't think. She just acted. She grabbed the spare rifle from the wagon bed and jumped down into the snow, boots slipping, heart hammering against her ribs. Josephine shouted after her. Walter gasped. Clara didn't stop moving. She pushed through deep drifts until she stood right above the two fighting men. Vane had Gideon pinned now, one knee pressed against his chest, both hands closing tight around his throat. Gideon's face had gone red, his breaths coming short and ragged, snow kicking up around him as he struggled against the grip. Vane laughed, breathless and wild. Should have let me take her, Marsh. You ain't built for this. Clara raised the rifle. Her arms shook, not from the weight of it, but from pure fear. Vane hadn't noticed her yet. Get off him, she said. Vane froze. His head turned slowly, and when he saw her standing there, his smile came back, ugly and overconfident. Put that down, woman. You ain't got the nerve. Clara's grip tightened around the stock. I'm a mother, she said. I've got more nerve than you'll ever understand in your life. Vane lunged toward her. Clara didn't hesitate for even a second. She swung the rifle like a hammer, and the wooden stock cracked hard against his temple. He collapsed into the snow, stunned, groaning weakly. Gideon shoved him off and staggered upright, coughing hard. Clara rushed to his side, grabbing his arm. He steadied himself, breath still harsh in his throat. You all right? She asked, her voice shaking. Gideon stared at her, not with shock exactly, but with something closer to awe. You saved my life, he said quietly. I protected my family, Clara whispered back. Vane moaned weakly, trying to crawl. Gideon stepped forward and pressed his boot firmly between the man's shoulders, pinning him in place with ease. Your reign ends here, he said, then signaled Vane's remaining men with a sharp whistle. Take him and ride out. If any of you come near my land again, you won't leave breathing. The two riders hesitated only a moment before hauling their leader up onto a horse. Vane cursed weakly, clutching at his bleeding head. Within seconds they were galloping away, disappearing down toward the lower valley. The mountains fell quiet again. Gideon let out a long breath, tension slowly draining from his shoulders. He turned to Clara. Thank you, he said. Clara tried to steady her own breathing. I only did what anyone would have done. No, Gideon said, shaking his head. Most wouldn't. Courage like that is rare. He reached out and brushed snow gently from her sleeve, a small tender motion she hadn't expected from him at all. His hand lingered there a moment longer than it needed to before he pulled it back. We need to move, he said quietly. They might come back later. They climbed back into the wagon. Gideon took up the reins, though Clara noticed a slight tremor still in his hands. Josephine, Walter, and the younger children all stared at their mother like they were seeing her clearly for the very first time. Mama, Walter whispered. You hit him so hard. Only because he tried to hurt us, Clara said, pulling him close. Josephine's eyes glimmered with something like pride. I knew you'd protect us. Clara swallowed the lump rising in her throat. Gideon flicked the reins. Hold on. We're close now. The trail climbed steeper, the forest growing thicker around them, and then, as they crested a ridge, the land finally opened up. Gideon's homestead sat tucked into a small valley, protected on all sides by tall pines and rock walls. A sturdy cabin built from hand-hewn logs, a barn, a smokehouse, neat stacks of firewood, a fenced pasture, a workshop with tools hanging in careful rows. It wasn't just a homestead. It was an entire life someone had built with years of patience and sweat. Clara felt something warm settle deep in her chest. Gideon slowed the horses to a stop. "Welcome home," he said. The words felt fragile and enormous all at once. Home. Her children stared at the cabin with wide, hopeful eyes. Josephine squeezed Clara's hand. Walter leaned forward, awestruck. Even little Henry sat up a little straighter in her lap. Gideon climbed down and offered Clara his hand. This time, when she took it, there was no uncertainty in the gesture at all. She felt strength. Not just his. Theirs. Together. As the children ran off to explore the snowy yard, Gideon stood beside Clara, his voice dropping low. "I meant what I said back in that cabin," he told her. "I wasn't out there looking for a wife. I was looking for somebody who could actually live this kind of life alongside me." He paused. "I didn't expect to find somebody stronger than I am." Clara's breath caught in her chest. "Gideon." He shook his head gently. "We'll build this slow," he said. "Steady. No forcing anything. But if you choose it, you and these children will never have to be afraid again. Not while I'm still breathing." Clara felt tears sting her eyes, and this time she didn't bother hiding them. She looked out at her children laughing in the fresh snow. She looked up at the mountains rising around them like silent guardians standing watch. And she looked at Gideon Marsh, the man this whole territory had learned to fear, but who had shown her more safety and more respect in 3 days than most people had shown her in her entire life. "I choose this," she said. Gideon's eyes softened, just for a moment, and he gave one final nod, like a promise sealing itself shut. And in that quiet valley, surrounded by snow and pine and the sound of her children's laughter finally ringing out free, Clara Whitfield, once called unwanted, once dismissed as too much trouble, once nearly torn apart by a world that had already given up on her, felt something entirely new begin to take root. A life built on courage instead of fear. A life built on love that grows slow, and honest, and real. A life up in the mountains, standing beside a man who had chosen her when nobody else would, and a family that nobody would ever be strong enough to break apart again. If a story like this one made you feel something, stick around, because sometimes the people the world writes off the fastest turn out to be the strongest ones in the whole room. They climbed back into the wagon. Gideon took up the reins, though Clara noticed a slight tremor still in his hands. Josephine, Walter, and the younger children all stared at their mother like they were seeing her clearly for the very first time. "Mama," Walter whispered. "You hit him so hard." "Only because he tried to hurt us," Clara said, pulling him close. Josephine's eyes glimmered with something like pride. "I knew you'd protect us." Clara swallowed the lump rising in her throat. Gideon flicked the reins. "Hold on. We're close now." The trail climbed steeper, the forest growing thicker around them, and then, as they crested a ridge, the land finally opened up. Gideon's homestead sat tucked into a small valley, protected on all sides by tall pines and rock walls. A sturdy cabin built from hand-hewn logs, a barn, a smokehouse, neat stacks of firewood, a fenced pasture, a workshop with tools hanging in careful rows. It wasn't just a homestead. It was an entire life someone had built with years of patience and sweat. Clara felt something warm settle deep in her chest. Gideon slowed the horses to a stop. "Welcome home," he said. The words felt fragile and enormous all at once. Home. Her children stared at the cabin with wide, hopeful eyes. Josephine squeezed Clara's hand. Walter leaned forward, awestruck. Even little Henry sat up a little straighter in her lap. Gideon climbed down and offered Clara his hand. This time, when she took it, there was no uncertainty in the gesture at all. She felt strength. Not just his. Theirs. Together. As the children ran off to explore the snowy yard, Gideon stood beside Clara, his voice dropping low. "I meant what I said back in that cabin," he told her. "I wasn't out there looking for a wife. I was looking for somebody who could actually live this kind of life alongside me." He paused. "I didn't expect to find somebody stronger than I am." Clara's breath caught in her chest. "Gideon." He shook his head gently. "We'll build this slow," he said. "Steady. No forcing anything. But if you choose it, you and these children will never have to be afraid again. Not while I'm still breathing." Clara felt tears sting her eyes, and this time she didn't bother hiding them. She looked out at her children laughing in the fresh snow, safe, warm, and finally still together. She looked up at the mountains rising around them like silent guardians standing watch. And she looked at Gideon Marsh, the man this whole territory had learned to fear, but who had shown her more safety and more respect in 3 days than most people had shown her in her entire life. "I choose this," she said. Gideon's eyes softened completely, and for the first time since she'd met him, he actually smiled. "Then," he said quietly. Then it settled. Winter passed. Spring came up through that valley green and slow, and the cabin that had once belonged to one silent man now rang out with the sound of 7 children and a woman who had refused to let the world break her. The town that once called her too much trouble to want never saw her again, not because she was hiding, but because she'd found somewhere better to be. Clara Whitfield had walked onto an auction block as a woman nobody wanted. She walked off it as the reason a hard man learned how to build a home instead of just a shelter. And in that quiet mountain valley, surrounded by pine and snow melt and the sound of her children's laughter, she finally understood something no one had ever told her before. She was never the burden. She was the whole reason worth building anything for at all. If a story like this one made you feel something, stick around, because sometimes the people the world writes off the fastest turn out to be the strongest ones in the whole room.